Welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think, a podcast project that seeks to find wisdom in conversation through the stories and personal reflections of regular people like you and me. My name is Ariane Rice, and I'm really grateful you're here. So let's get started. Hi there. Well, here I am, just me, without a conversation partner for this episode. Now, I want you to know that was not an intention of this podcast project, but life happens, right? Some people have been sick, schedules have been a little bit off because of holidays, and a bunch of people are getting recorded, which I'm really excited about in the next few weeks. But I wanted to release something this week because, believe it or not, one of the joys of doing something like this, for me anyway, is that there is some joy in the discipline of an artificial deadline. I mean, nobody's putting a deadline on me to send this podcast out into the world, but I kind of crave order and structure, and I've fallen into this habit of releasing an episode on Wednesdays, and I'd like to keep it that way. So here I am, and I wanted to talk with you today about something I think about a lot because of my job and because of these conversations I've been having that seem to always circle back to feelings that are harder for us to talk about than others, feelings that are hard to even feel, quite honestly. And so I thought of recording this because this afternoon, I just got back from leading a funeral service. And maybe you have already picked up on the fact that as a priest, I spend a significant amount of my time leading funerals and being with families when someone has died. It's something that's a lot more frequent than I ever thought it would be. It certainly had nothing, I didn't think about it when I went into being a priest. It was certainly not about being with people and doing funerals. But the thing that's odd, or at least it's odd to kind of say this, is that doing funerals, it's really been a good thing. And I'm really grateful that I get to do it. Now, I'm not a morbid person. I think I'm a pretty happy person with a pretty good sense of humor, even if it gets kind of sarcastic and cynical at times. I very much like to laugh. And actually, that's one of the things I've learned at funerals. Most funerals I've done, there's laughter there. Because when people get together to remember someone, to give thanks for someone, they tell stories. And it is such a joy to share those stories, to share these memories, and to see people laugh, to really authentically be with other people as they share something so special. And to me, one of the signs of a good funeral is one where people are laughing and crying at the same time. Back in 2020, I think 2021, I wrote a blog piece on Medium, and it was called Why I Like a Good Funeral. And I wonder if that sounds odd to people, but I also know that some of you out there, you know exactly what I mean by that title, right? I mean, if you get a group of priests together, believe me, because I've been together with a group of priests, if you get us together and you say, what would you rather do? Would you rather do a wedding or a funeral? Hands down, the majority of priests, believe it or not, will pick a funeral over a wedding any day. Now, of course, I do not want anyone to die. Please do not misunderstand me. I don't want to do funerals when somebody has died in a tragic way. I don't want that for anyone. But we need good funerals. And the reason why they're a gift to do, and the reason why I prefer them to a wedding, is because people are real at a funeral. They're real about where they're at, what they can take in, what they just can't. I mean, I just don't think you and I are wired to conceptually really understand what death is. I don't think we can really get that in the way we understand a lot of other things. I mean, we know it. We know it when it happens. We know it does happen. But when it happens to us, when it happens to you and me, when someone in my life who has always been there, when all of a sudden they are not there, well, there's just before and then there's after. I mean, everything is different. My body feels different. My emotions are certainly different. And it surprises me. It has surprised me. It surprised me in my ability or inability to manage who I am when I am experiencing such a life-altering event. That's the thing about death. One of the ways to describe death is that it's life-altering. In fact, in the Episcopal service that I do, we have a phrase that we say, life is changed, not ended. And of course, that theologically, it points to the fact that we believe in life eternal, but it's also a really pragmatic statement for those of us who are still here. My life has changed when someone close to me has died. One of the things I reflect on often that has already come up in this podcast for me is the experience of when my sister died. When she died, she was 40 years old. I was about 45 years old. Well, when she died, I'd been expecting that. I am the eldest of three of us. She was the middle child. We were close and not so close. We had a lot of ins and a lot of outs. We grew up around some hard stuff. And a lot of the time that her and I were not close, well, a lot of it had to do with the struggle she had with drugs and alcohol and trying to manage her own mental illness and dealing with addictions. So when she died, it wasn't as if it was out of the realm of possibility for me. I mean, in my 20s, in my 30s, I had been summoned to hospital wards. I had raced to psych wards many times. I knew what it was to get late night phone calls. I knew what it was, to be really angry about some of those late night phone calls. And it was something that was familiar. But no matter what, you can't really prepare yourself for such a life-altering event. And I really remember the day that I got that phone call. And the strange thing is I was at church. I was in my office and I was about to go and do a funeral. That's right. I remember it very well because it was a Tuesday after a holiday weekend and it was 9:30 in the morning and the funeral started at 10 a.m. But I saw that my dad was calling on my cell phone, which I usually don't pick up the phone right before I go and do a funeral, but because it was my dad, I picked it up. And I remember he said, "Well, we almost lost her." And his voice sounded a little strange. But that phrase tells you something about how familiar we all were with this, right? And I don't really remember what it was that we said to each other on the phone, but I do remember asking him questions. And I remember knowing in my heart that this time would be different. She was in a coma. She had intentionally overdosed. And at some point, I got off the phone with my dad because I had to go to work. And believe it or not, I had every intention of hanging up that phone and walking onto that altar and leading the funeral for that person and their family. And the priest who was working with me at the time came into my office and I told them what had just happened. But then I started experiencing what I'm talking about. The reality of what was happening as I shared that with this person, all of a sudden I could tell my legs weren't going to hold me up anymore. And they started shaking and I needed to sit down. That's what I mean when all of a sudden these things happen and it's like your body surprises you. Because something was happening that I could not make sense of. It was just way too big for me to compartmentalize it and file it away and then go and do my job. So the priest who I was working with went in and did lead that funeral service, and I called my dad back. And I do remember asking to speak with the nurse because I knew from going to the hospital for other people at that point in time, I knew that nurses, they always tell it to you straight, pretty plainly. They tell you what you need to hear, which is exactly what happened. So 2 days later, my sister died. I did get to speak with her on the phone before she did, or actually, to be clear, I spoke. She listened because she never woke up from that coma. And you know what? I did not race home to see her. I made an intentional decision at that time, very much in an effort to take care of myself and my daughter, who was 8, because I knew I would be going home soon enough when the inevitable happened. And when I went home for that funeral service, that's when I learned everything, or maybe I learned the beginning of everything that I now know. Everything that I believe is important and necessary for a good funeral. That's when I learned just how much it means, and why I always tell people, just text, just call, and if you can, just show up and be there for them at the funeral. Because it makes such a huge difference to hear from people these messages of love and support. That's when I learned just how exhausting grief is, and the expectations I had placed on families before that in terms of what I needed them to tell me about what they needed for the funeral, the readings and the hymns and all the specificities of these things. You can barely get through this whole thing. It is exhausting to try and answer all these questions, which, by the way, is why it's really a gift when you make plans for your family and you just write the whole service down exactly as you want it, because then the people who have to plan it, you've given them a gift in giving them exactly what it is they need to do. That's also, by the way, how I learned that whatever the rubrics are in the prayer book, those rules that tell us what we can and cannot do, quote unquote, well, guess what? They don't matter. They don't matter at all. Unless you are putting those rules and rubrics into place to create some sort of structure for a family that has no ground underneath them, for people whose legs are shaking a lot because they're walking through something they've never walked through before and nobody knows how to do it, especially the first time. So when you use that ritual to bring some kind of order and comfort to people who are trying to say goodbye, that's what those rubrics are intended for. It was at that funeral, my sister's funeral, where I did the one thing that I am always terrified that other people will do at my church when I am the priest at the funeral. And that is going off book. One of the things I love about being a priest, which is why I like putting out episodes on a disciplined, orderly timetable, is that everything is planned. Everything has a liturgical place and a place for everything in the liturgy. So I am always a little concerned if people go off book in the midst of what it is we sat around and planned we would all do. But guess what? I did just that. I sang. I wasn't supposed to sing. We hadn't talked about my singing, but I am a singer. I used to sing opera, and I studied voice in college. And my sister was certainly very used to seeing me perform in a lot of different capacities. So as I was standing there on the altar, reading the prayers, which was the only thing I was supposed to do at that funeral, it occurred to me, in the midst of reading these prayers, it occurred to me that Christiana, that was my sister, Christiana was staring down at us, and she was looking at me saying, like, why in the world are you not singing at my funeral? My gosh, you sing at every single family event we ever have. And so the minute I was done with the prayers, I turned to the priest and I said, I'm sorry, but I need to do one more thing while I'm up here. And my legs were shaking too, by the way. And I asked everybody to pick up a hymnal and open to Amazing Grace. And then I sang it. And when I sang it, I stared at that coffin. I kind of sang it to her. I had seen that done at wakes before in my church, particularly in Durham, North Carolina. And I was always so incredibly moved by it. And so that's what I did. And I sang that hymn and I changed some of the words. You know, she once was lost, but now she's found. She was blind, but now she sees. And I cried most of the way through it too, which is when I also learned it's really not that bad when you cry on the altar in front of people. In fact, it lets everybody know it's okay to feel whatever feelings you're feeling, because sometimes just thinking about them isn't enough. Now, my family is Roman Catholic, and that's how I was brought up. And I was terrified that the priest at this church, at the Roman Catholic church where we had the funeral, I'd convinced myself and was terrified that he would give me a hard time about wearing my clericals to her funeral, you know, my clergy uniform. Because, my friends, that day, I didn't want to be the priest, but being a priest, I knew that would somehow hold me together through the day. Like literally that collar, that thing around my neck, it would hold me. And I think other clergy relate to what I'm talking about. And I'm sure lots of professionals who wear uniforms understand what I'm talking about. You put that thing on and it changes you. It changes your persona and who you are. And that day, it was a source of strength. And thanks be to God, that priest, he was totally fine with it. In fact, he was gracious beyond every expectation, and he invited me to share in every single aspect of that Mass. Roman Catholic rubrics, be damned. And guess what? That is something for which I will always be grateful. And that's when I learned that when it comes to a funeral, if you can simply be a priest who is a person, who can just do the job that needs to be done, do your job in saying the prayers and bringing some measure of the reality of the sacredness that we lift up and give thanks for, and that a life that was with us is now no longer with us. If you can use the tradition that you've been given to simply provide some guidance and comfort to a hurting family and just let them be however it is that they need to be, that is all you need to do. And that is such a good thing. The priest at that funeral, he preached a homily. From the steps, he stood right on the floor. He looked right at me and my parents and my other sister, and I don't remember one word of what he said, but I know he talked about love and love and love. And that's when I learned no one needs to go on and on as the priest at a funeral, unless you just are talking about faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. And that's what I do when I preach a funeral. I just try and remind everybody there that God loves each and every one of us, and that the love of God we can just never, ever, ever be separated from that love in this life or the next. So I don't really like funerals. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I am grateful for a good funeral. I'm grateful I was with that family today and I got to listen to their stories as they shared about the person who they were giving thanks for. I'm grateful that I got to see people loving each other, being kind and compassionate to one another, and to laugh and to cry, because it is just this incredible gift to be in this liminal space with people very intentionally. People that I barely know sometimes, but just to come together and share such an appreciation of life and awareness of the good gifts we are given. So that's all. I just wanted to share a little bit about that with you because for some reason, I believe this is something more of us need to be reminded of. I think that's part of my job, honestly, in sharing the good news and part of this project in thinking about what it is that we feel. And for whatever reason, and who knows, maybe this is true in your life too, there are just a fair number of funerals on my plate right now. I'm not even sure what it is, but it's just really a part of my world. So maybe it's a part of yours, and maybe this is something you need to hear. So I'll close with something that I think all of us need to hear, but it's something I always say to families at that particular time. I just always remind them to be kind to themselves, be compassionate with themselves, and just take it easy. Just take it easy. And surround yourself with people who will be kind and take care of you and help you take it easy too. Believe it or not, this podcast helps me take it easy. So thanks for listening to this, and I look forward next week to sharing more conversations about what it is we're feeling and how we're thinking and talking about it.